multilingual scholar, a former journalist, and an independent politician who has accepted to join one of Europe's right-wing populist governments, she now represents a country that is driving the EU's anti-immigrant agenda. An expert on the Middle East, she's become one of Austria's most colourful and vocal cabinet ministers, and even had Vladimir Putin at her wedding last year. I'm Ghida Fakhry in Davos, and I'm speaking with Karin Kneissl, Austria's foreign minister, one-on-one. Madam Minister, thanks very much for being with us. Austria recently ended its presidency of the Council of the European Union. As you know, the EU is going through quite turbulent times with the whole Brexit issue. Do you feel that the UK is making a mistake by leaving the EU?
This is a decision that was taken by the voters in the United Kingdom. I would never call that a mistake or anything else. It's a purely internal affair. But the British, and we accepted it. I think this has to be done in a democratic procedure.
But what do you think it suggests about the wave of popular resentment and dissatisfaction there seems to be in many European countries these days about the increasing powers of Brussels? Do you think, for example, if there was a referendum, a similar referendum in countries like Hungary, the Czech Republic, even Austria, with populist governments, that people would not follow suit?
Well, first of all, let me reject the notion of populist government. I consider myself as a minister of a government that was elected in a democratic way, like it's the case in most countries on the globe, and I don't appreciate this term populism.
No, I mean, you may be an independent
politician, it has nothing to do
with...
But the government is
seen, the Freedom Party is seen as a right-wing party,
whatever you call it now, right-wing or whatever, but when you take the semantic root of populism, where does it come from? From populus, people. I mean, it says in our constitution very clearly, all power stems from the people, populus, yeah? So let me reject at this point of our talk the term populism, because I simply don't take it. So to come back to your question, no, because having observed the cumbersome procedures, having observed the uncertainty that prevails now in the British public opinion, but above all also among investors, companies, employers. So according to findings, and this is now not my personal opinion, we speak here of empirical findings by Eurostat, the desire to have a skeptical view of the European Union, or even maybe ask for a leaving, has tremendously declined in Austria. I can't speak of Hungary, I don't know the statistics in Hungary, but when it comes to Austria, there's not the slightest desire to leave the European Union.
Fine, be that as it may, I want to get back to your rejection of the notion of populist, because when anyone looks at the statements that have been made in Austria by the Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, the term that is often used is populist to describe him and his statements. And just one example is him recently making the remarks that he would like to see some kind of an anti-immigrant nexus being created with Germany and Italy and Austria. He wants to increase the borders and security to keep refugees and immigrants outside of Austria. What do you describe this rhetoric?
I don't describe it as populist. And it's not an anti-immigration topic. It's the obligation of every government to control its border and its territory. That's written down in the constitution. And exis might have been not the proper term, but again, it's not up to me to judge that. What is in place is, or what is in need, and Chancellor Merkel herself has stated it last year, is more cooperation. Sometimes you do it on a bilateral level, sometimes on a trilateral level, because unfortunately so far we have not been able to achieve clear-cut decisions on migration, on common standards, on asylum seekers among the 28. And one of the main problems that we have seen in 2015, 2016 is that, let us take a country like Portugal. Portugal had offered more than 70,000 places for resettlement of Syrian refugees. This offer was rejected by many because for the simple reason that social benefits in Sweden or Germany are higher.
Sure, but let's talk about Austria. Austria, many people would argue, is moving increasingly towards a less tolerant place.
Let me reject that. May I reject that on the very first ground? Because for the very, if I may interfere here, because who has taken the highest number of refugees? May I ask you?
Germany has.
No, per capita. I speak now of per capita. Yeah. Who has done that?
Well, if
if
Austria has done that, then please answer this question. Why did Austria not participate in the Marrakesh Migration Compact conference? And why did it refuse to officially back the non-binding Global Compact for Migration?
For the very evident reason, like many other countries did, that we cannot agree with 12 out of 23 objectives in there. For instance, and I speak here also as a former independent correspondent, I don't like the obligation that public funds should go to editorial offices who write nicely about migration, and those who have a skeptical opinion should not get any public funds. This is a form of censorship, and I myself as a correspondent was affected by that back in 2015 when I voiced a critical opinion about what was going on. I myself, speaking Arabic, I did a lot of interpretation for people in refugee shelters. And I can tell after 2 sentences whether somebody is from Syria or is from Morocco. And we had, for instance, a high number of Moroccans coming to Austria. And here we don't speak of political refugees, we speak of migrants. And if I may just put one thing clear here, we accepted completely the refugee compact, but we voted in abstention when it came to the migration compact. So at the General Assembly, we abstained.
But let me just, again, pick on something you said. You talked about the importance of protecting one's borders, and of course it's the duty of every government. But would you agree that there are different ways of doing it and that the political discourse is important? You mentioned that you speak Arabic, and I know that you have huge expertise and knowledge about the culture, the languages, the history of the Middle East, having lived and taught there for many years. So perhaps you may be more sensitive to the perceived Muslim threat, quote unquote,
I don't take it
that
because
some in the EU see
because
and
I have been
into
speaking.
their policies.
Yeah, but if I may interfere here, you know what irritates most of my friends in the Middle East, that hundreds of thousands of people were admitted to enter without even showing their papers, only by saying asylum, while others who come for education, who do business, have to go through a very cumbersome process. And most of my colleagues, also those I have been to Syria very regularly over the last years, most of my colleagues, my age, I was born in 1965, they tell me, you see, I don't speak Swedish, I don't speak German, I don't want to spend now the next few years in a refugee shelter somewhere in Europe. So it's not about an anti-Muslim feeling or so on. Most of my colleagues, whether they are in Damascus, in Beirut or somewhere else, they don't understand the behavior of many European governments back in 2015.
Okay, well, before moving on to other issues, let me just briefly, though, touch on something that was just said on Sunday by the Italian Deputy Prime Minister. He talked about the need to tackle the root causes of immigration. He says that some European countries, chiefly France, has played a detrimental role in impoverishing a lot of African countries that they colonize and pushing them onto European shores. Does he have a point? Does Europe have a responsibility to bear?
I refrain from commenting other people's position. This is not my position. That's not my role as Minister for Foreign Affairs. I'm responsible for the Austrian foreign policy. And sorry, I don't comment other people. If you have checked...
He's called on EU sanctions against France. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't comment him simply for that. You see, there are certain things which I simply refrain commenting.
All right, let's move on, if we can, to the wider Middle East. And you mentioned the fact that you speak Arabic. And I heard you make a speech in Arabic at the UN General Assembly, your first speech as Foreign Minister of Austria. In it, you made some interesting remarks. You said that after World War I, the Middle East was shaped by the oil industry. The new map of the region was based on pipelines, and then the borders were drawn. Exactly. You also said that the recent Middle East wars were fought in the name of oil. Has much changed since those days? Because Trump was quite blunt when he said, let's just take the oil.
To a certain extent, little has changed. And when we take also the war of 2003, I was one of the voices that said, don't make war in Iraq. It was very much about oil interests. So it continues. I mean, the Middle East remains an object of desire because of its fossil reserves. And we are observing, the latest book that I published before turning into minister was on the role of China as a geopolitical actor and not just as an investor. And here we see, we have been watching it over the last 15 years, that pipelines and also airlines keep turning east and not west.
And so what lessons do you think the Europeans have learned about the Middle East? And would you say there is one cogent Middle East policy toward the Middle East?
No, we don't have a very coherent Middle East policy because inter alia of the historic responsibilities, you mentioned colonialism. We have always had special roles seen by certain capitals in Europe. We have the responsibility of certain countries in Europe when it comes to the Holocaust. So all that has always been an inherent feature to divergent opinions versus also different countries in the Middle East. So this is not something that we can just get out of the equation. But since you asked me on oil and gas, it's not anymore Europe that is the #1 client of Middle Eastern oil and gas, it's Asia.
You mentioned Asia, but looking at the EU and the interesting dynamics that are taking shape there, you say there's no one EU policy toward the Middle East. How would you look at EU policy toward Russia these days? Would you say that, or accept the fact that the EU may have put itself in a box when it comes to the situation of Crimea and Georgia and even the attempted murder of the Skripals in the UK, imposing sanctions since 2014, renewing them just recently in December? Has it really boxed itself? Has it overreacted? What's the way out?
No, I wouldn't say that it has overreacted because annexation of territory is violation of international law. And the consequence of that has been sanctions, which, as you just described, have been prolonged.
You have an old relationship with Vladimir Putin, a personal relationship. He came to your wedding back in August at the height of these tensions with the EU. Some people saw it as a Russian PR stunt. Others saw you waltz with him, but read more into it. Was there more of a political dance going on there?
I know that journalists love to overinterpret things, but one should just stick to the facts.
But what are the facts?
The fact that I invited him spontaneously, he attended, and that's it.
And you said at the time it was a personal matter. Exactly. But I mean, you are a personal figure, the Foreign Minister of Austria. Were you sending some kind of messages as well that there's two Europes when it comes to dealing with Russia?
No, there you are overinterpreting. My answer is no.
Okay, clear no answer. Moving on to Iran, if I may. On the Iranian issue, another thorn in the side of EU-US relations, with the United States having pulled out of that nuclear agreement. Where do you see the situation involving Iran going?
Well, we do our utmost to make this agreement deliverable because it was supposed to have perspectives for investors to open up the Iranian market. And there was a tremendous expectation. I've been traveling to Iran over the last 20 years, at least once a year. And I attended various business fora, and it was always about what all the perspectives that will be opened up by the JCPOA. And unfortunately, these perspectives didn't materialize for various reasons. And that was long before the United States pulled out.
And do you think it's okay for the US to dictate its terms to other countries in terms of who they can and cannot do business with? And I wonder whether Austria has any intention of joining a new mechanism, an EU-Iran mechanism that's known as the SPV, the Special Purpose Vehicle, to circumvent these sanctions. We know that the likelihood is that France, Germany and Britain will be in. Will Austria be in as well?
It's under discussion between different ministries. It's not the discussion of one ministry. So far we have not yet seen the conditions of that SPV in clear-cut manner, and I put several questions to the authors of that special purpose vehicle, but it's under discussion.
And do you think that Austria should be able to
I gave you my answer.
So
it's not my decision.
It's
an interministerial decision.
Let me ask you about Jerusalem. Last year, Israel invited some 86 ambassadors based in Israel to attend the US Embassy relocation to Jerusalem. I believe Austria was just one of 4 European countries. I wonder
sorry, if I may just correct here. There was a cocktail in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. It was not on the occasion of the opening up of the US embassy. So it's our practice to attend cocktails. Attending a cocktail does not have any legal or political implication.
But was Austria, though, supportive of the idea of the US relocating its embassy?
No, not
because
at all.
many people interpreted it.
Yeah, well,
as such.
again, we are here with interpretation, and one should stick to the facts. There was a cocktail in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel, and that was the day before the opening of the embassy. The reception at the day of the opening up of the embassy was not attended by us.
So are you saying unequivocally that Austria, this neutral country that everyone knows as a bulwark of, as a strong defender of international law, has not changed its perspective when it comes to Jerusalem?
Because have you ever heard somebody attending a cocktail and thereby creating international law?
So where do you stand specifically on this issue then?
Well, of course, we consider the annexation of East Jerusalem and of other parts as illegal.
As going against international law, definitively?
Well,
Against UN Security Council resolutions?
East Jerusalem was annexed in 1980, and there has been consequential protest against that.
Interesting, though, that you once made this statement. You said about Israel, I have the impression that Israel often gets measured by a particularly tall measuring stick. And I believe that the relationship between Israel and Europe could need an injection of realism, you say. This is something that Austria is actively working on. Israel's neighbors are not Switzerland and Liechtenstein. It would do Europe good to remember this sometimes. Yeah. But my question is, none of the neighbors of Switzerland or Liechtenstein are occupying the territory of another country. As you well know, having lived in Lebanon, is the case with the Bekaa Farms, with the Golan Heights, with the whole of Palestine, with the fact that settlements continue every single day. Definitely. Israel is a nuclear power state. A lot of people liken it to an apartheid state, yet you say it is being measured with an incredibly tall measuring stick.
Yes, definitely, because when we just like let us take, I've been there during 2 intifadas, and the intifadas were definitely an uprising. Everybody was taken by surprise, including the PLO, Palestinian leadership, were taken by surprise by the first intifada in 1987. And it was highly watched, broadcasted, etc. in 1987-88. And when we see the dramatic war situation in neighboring countries, such as Syria. I also happened to be as a child during Black September in Jordan, but I remember the corpses of Black September. So again, we should keep everything in perspective, and Israel has violated and keeps on violating international law when it comes to, for instance, topics such as settlements in the occupied territories. But there are many other topics where there is a much more critical eye on Israel acting with regard to what is going on in the region by and large. That's what I wanted to make my point on that. But I cannot impede anybody from, again, here also over-interpreting, and that's up to everybody. But I also, when I was a correspondent, I always tried to remain to the facts and to what, and not to overdraw, to overstretch a phrase.
Sticking to the facts is what we try to do, specifically by interviewing people like you to set the record straight. Just looking back briefly and then forward for a moment. In 1979, Chancellor Bruno Kreisky, himself Jewish, was the first Western leader to, at the time, host PLO chairman Yasser Arafat. In those days, Austria, many people would have said, was really on the map. Before being Chancellor, Kreisky was Minister of Foreign Affairs. My question is, can Karin Kneissl, also an independent politician, Minister of Foreign Affairs, one day become Chancellor of Austria in a way that might put Austria on the map like it was in the old days?
Well, I think Austria is very much on the map now. And the old days, you should also bear in mind, our neutrality within the midst of the Cold War was a completely different geopolitical situation. Bruno Kreisky could, as statement, together with other neutral countries like Sweden or his colleagues in Finland, the non-aligned movement, the neutral and non-aligned, it was a completely different system of international affairs. And just to make also a distinction between Bruno Kreisky and myself, Bruno Kreisky, whom I respect a lot, unfortunately I never met him, but he was not an independent. He was a socialist with every cell of his heart. And I have respect for everybody who makes his or her career through a political party, but I myself chose a different way. And maybe my life could have been easier when I was a junior diplomat to belong to a political party. I quitted diplomacy 20 years ago because I felt the pressure of political parties. And I made my professional and other way by being an independent. And Bruno Kreisky was the head of the Social Democrat Party. So that's also a big difference.
Finally, if I can, just have you tell us a little bit of what you think in terms of where the world is moving to these days. I'm thinking about the Trump phenomenon and what it means for the rest of the world. America first, the increasing protectionism, the diminishing of the global order in the world. It was interesting for me to read your statements in a recent interview in which you said none of President Trump's statements gave you any cause for concern. That was surprising, despite the trade wars and the migration issues and the walls and the
I don't remember now that I said that I gave such a statement. I don't recall that. I think, I mean, first of all, I always say I'd refrain from commenting other people's statements. This is not my work. I was an analyst. If you had asked me this question 1.5 years ago, I could have elaborated on it in all kinds of details as long as I was a commentator, an analyst, a teacher of international relations. But having turned into minister, my task, at least that's the way I personally see it and practice it, is not in commenting, but in making my own work as a minister operative. And that's why I try to be active.
Sure, and being active, you're here in Davos, having met a lot of people, having talked a lot about the main theme that people are discussing here, globalization in the fourth industrial age. What are your main thoughts about the changing dynamics in the world and the way in which the world is moving? Of course, again, with the fears of a global slowdown that many people here are talking about.
I mean, it's very clear that the social question is back. And this was maybe underestimated by some people responsible, whether in media, whether in economic affairs or in political responsibility. The name of the game today, and I discussed it yesterday with some of my counterparts, such as Christine Lagarde and also people in the oil business, the name of the game today is affordable mobility, affordable energy. We have seen it again and again when, for instance, subsidized oil prices, wherever that was the case, were cut. That led to social unrest. Now, inside the European Union, we don't have subsidized oil, petrol or gasoline, but we have highly taxed petrol and gasoline. So when you raise the taxes there, as was the case in one important EU country, then that can lead to social turmoil.
Finally, Madam Minister, my last question. You and I were on a panel yesterday that I moderated on the Eurasia region and the increasing dynamics there in light of China's growing influence. From a European perspective, how do you see that region and the emerging economies of Central Asia and the Caucasus, which a lot of people are focusing quite a bit of attention on?
Well, Central Asia has always been on the map as what Harold Mackinder in 1904 called the heartland, and the thesis of Harold Mackinder, the famous British geographer, who can be considered the father of modern geopolitics, even though he did not yet use that term, is that whoever controls heartland, as he called it, controls the world. And having taught geopolitics and energy over many decades, I have always referred to Harold Mackinder. Now, when Mackinder wrote his articles on that, he did not think of oil and gas. It was all about strategic depths. Now we speak of oil and gas, and I mentioned it also yesterday that when I went back to some of the publications in the early 1990s, the US were there, Turkey was there, Iran, especially when we speak of the Caspian Basin, but not People's Republic of China. And of course, now People's Republic of China, ever since 2013, with the very detailed going west strategy, as it was called initially, then it turned into one belt, one road. But it all had to do with developing the far west of China, and that then led more and more into Central Asia. So we are here in the replay of the famous great game that was played by the British against the Persians of 19th century, against the Ottomans of 19th century, and Mr. Brzezinski published his book on the new great game in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and he didn't think maybe in those days of the emergence of China the way we have it today.
And it's interesting, a lot of people looking at this debate argue that the rise and decline of powers and superpowers will no longer be determined by geostrategy moving forward, but by technology. And in the words of President Putin, whoever controls AI, artificial intelligence, will actually rule the world. Do you agree with this statement?
My guest reading is geography back and the social question is back. And I always refer to Otto von Bismarck, who said geography is the constant factor of history.
Madam Minister, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.